Good afternoon. I'm Deborah Lowenberg-Ball. I'm from the University of Michigan. I have the great honor of moderating this roundtable that we have designed in honor of the Executive Director, Felice J. Levine, on her stepping down, departing, and we have so much that we appreciate about all you've done. It is not my moment to say all of those things, but I'd like to begin by asking our President, Janelle Scott, to please come up.
Good afternoon. So I'm not sure how many of you were at the previous awards session, but if you weren't, we ended the session by announcing a new award that AERA will give out next year, named after Felice, that will honor mentoring in research and leadership. And, you know, Felice keeps saying she hopes we're not doing too much, not making too big of a deal. But I'm so surprised, since she knows me pretty well, that we have things up our sleeve, including this session. And I want to thank Deborah and Naila and Vivian Gadsden and the planning committee for organizing the session, and the panelists, who we'll hear from momentarily. But before we begin, I'm thrilled and excited to announce something else. Yep. Hang on to your hat, Felice. So again, with unanimous support from AERA Council, we are thrilled to announce the naming of the Dr. Felice J. Levine Convening Center at AERA. Named in honor of Dr. Felice J. Levine, AERA Executive Director from 2002 to 2025, with deepest gratitude for her visionary leadership, tireless dedication, advancement of education research, and commitment to justice, this space is dedicated in recognition of her extraordinary service as Executive Director. You can say words for 30 seconds.
30 seconds. I am honored. It's a wonderful convening center. and now we really need to bring it back post-COVID, you know, and we have. It was established as an inward opportunity to collaborate internal to the organization, but as part of our outward facing. So I am thrilled, really, to have this named after me, and we got to make it a go together. So thank you very much.
So welcome again. The name of this special session is Leveraging Research for the Public Good, a Scholars Roundtable honoring the contributions of Felice J. Levine. And this has been designed by a group of people, as thank you so much to Vivian Gadsden, Naila Nasir, and many others who contributed to designing this session, as well as all of my fellow panelists here. So the origin of this is to think and to honor Felice for your constantly lifting up the role of research in policy, in practice, in affairs much broader than just our organization. And we wanted to have an opportunity to have a conversation today with a group of people with disparate places that they work, different kinds of expertise, to discuss that in some depth of what is so important about that. In a few minutes, I'll say a little more about how we're going to get started. We've met and we've talked a bit about what we might do. We're so glad that you're all here today, and there will be some time for you to raise questions later in the session. I'd like to begin by introducing our panelists, and they will also tell you more about them as it pertains to what we're talking about today. So first, let's see the order here. I guess I'll start way on the left there. So on your far left is Leah Watson, who is a senior staff attorney with the ACLU's Racial Justice Program, where she focuses on classroom censorship and the attack on DEI. She's litigating challenges to educational gag orders in Florida, Oklahoma, and New Hampshire, as well as at the federal level. She authored the Anti-Critical Race Theory campaign, Classroom Censorship and Racial Backlash by Another Name, in the Harvard Civil Liberties Law Review. To her right, and to your second to the left, we have Rachel Pereira. Rachel is a fellow in the Brown Center on Education Policy at Brookings. Her research focuses on civil rights and education, school discipline, and the politics of education. Rachel's status as a lead emerging scholar is reflected in her being named both a National Academy of Education Spencer Dissertation Fellow and a joint scholar of the AERA Minority Dissertation Fellowship in Education Research and the AERA and National Science Foundation's Grants Program. Moving across the stage, we next have David D. Matthews, who, if you were in the awards luncheon, just has received an award for his role in public communication. David D. Matthews is the W.K. Kellogg Endowed Professor in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy at the University of Texas, Austin. He's also the director of the Cooperative Superintendency Program. Prior to arriving at UT Austin in 2018, David was an assistant professor at the University of Texas, El Paso, and he began his career in education working as a teacher, a campus leader, and a district administrator in Baltimore City Public Schools and the District of Columbia Public Schools. Moving again, Lisa Eberson is the president of the World Education Research Association. In addition, she's the director of the Center for the Study of Resilience and a professor in the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Pretoria. She's a registered educational psychologist and an expert on the dimensions of social dimensions of resilience. Through membership and invited engagement in global education and well-being platforms, she's influential worldwide in education development circles to inform policy, training, and practice for sustainable transformation in the global South. And here, not finally, but on the far right, is Kent McGuire. Kent McGuire is many things, but I will focus particularly on his current role. He's the program director of education at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. I wasn't trying to be funny. If I was, then so much the better. So he's the program director of education at the Hewlett Foundation. So he leads the investments of the foundation's work on teaching and learning and open education resource strategies with a focus on helping all students succeed in college, work, and civic life. Kent is a veteran of the National Education Movement for Public Education and many more things that we will learn about all of these wonderful people as we move through the conversation. So again, thank you so much for being here. We'll hear more about both what they're thinking about, what they do, where they've been, and how all of that combines to the sorts of perspectives they can bring to this conversation. And again, Felice, this is in your honor for how much you've led this association to concentrate on what our contributions can be into public discourse and policy problems. And as these folks have occupied different places in that work, I think you'll hear reflected back both where we need to go, but also how much we want to honor you for your leadership in this way. So to begin, what we'd like to do is just say a little bit more about how we're going to honor you. And one of I think the focal question that we want to kick off with today is, what is the role of evidence and research in supporting the public good? And what does that actually look like in the current times? But before we dive into that question, which sounds interesting and there's plenty we could say about it, it's probably worth scrutinizing these terms even as we move into it. What do we actually mean by the public good? What do different people mean by that? What do we want to mean by that? What do we mean by evidence? There are equally a number of views about what that means and what people mean when they say that, or what do we mean by research? So we don't want to take terms like that for granted. And what does it mean to be supporting whatever we mean by the public good? What is support? And I think we can think about multiple ways to be considering that. We don't want the conversation to only focus on what some people are calling this moment, but we certainly do want to take account of the climate, the context in which we're in. But the issues that we're talking about and that for which Felice has provided leadership are ongoing, of long-term, and will continue in our work going forward. So we will center the current moment, and we will also think more broadly about the future, about the past, and where we want to be going. So the panel, as you probably could hear from my introductions, includes representatives from education, research, teaching, philanthropy, and the law. And all of these people work in the service of the public good. So just to kick it off, I'm going to ask a question to sort of launch, and then I'm going to join them. And we'll be having kind of a conversation. I may ask them questions they don't know that I'm going to ask them, but I know from having talked with them already that they have a great deal to contribute to all of our thinking. So I'm so glad to see all of you here. So just to start, what I'd like to ask you each to start, and maybe would you be willing to start off, Leah? Would that be okay? What do you see as the principal, given your standpoint, like where you work, what you do, what do you see as the principal role of knowledge, scholarship, and expertise in supporting however you think about the public good? What are you centering when you think about that phrase, the public good? What are you thinking about when you think it means to support it? And what is your work about in that space? And are there opportunities, this is a lot, but you could at least kick us off. Are there particular opportunities at this moment or risks? Are there barriers? Are there things that we could be trying to do? And we'll kind of build on that across us and kind of try to be having a conversation as we discussed. So please join me in welcoming the panel, and we'll get underway.
I believe this is on, right? Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's such an honor to be here with each of you and to be as a part of this esteemed panel. I'll be coming at this, my comments primarily from my role as an attorney, hoping to support education, and also from my perspective as a K-12 teacher before law school. When thinking about the public good and the role of research, I really think a lot about moving the needle, both for the public generally right now in the fight that we're having about education and what belongs in the classroom and who gets to control what students are taught, and more importantly, who gets to censor what students are taught. It's really important to think about moving the public with us, and there is a false narrative that was intentionally created, admittedly, by conservatives to misrepresent what is happening in classrooms right now. So I think part of the role of research is both to explain what students are being taught, but the importance of why they are being taught in these ways, the importance of the pedagogical strategies, not just for students of one group, but students of all groups. When you think about culturally responsive or sustaining techniques, those aren't just for Black kids or brown kids. All students are benefiting across various levels of engagement, and I think making clear to parents why they should want their students to benefit from these strategies that we know are working and are currently being targeted. Outside of the public more generally, I would also say we're speaking to the courts, and we need research to back up what we're saying. I'm tasked with being a zealous advocate, which means they don't trust what I say independently. I have to always support it. And the ways that I'm supporting it are by pulling upon research that has been conducted, incorporating that into briefs, using researchers to serve as experts to talk about the consequences and really make clear what is at stake with these decisions that can sometimes feel abstract but have very real consequences for students and educators. And then also thinking through other ways of highlighting the issues to make sure that we have the full scope, maybe through amicus briefs or other ways of thinking through for us, and also making sure that the court is really understanding the full scope of the issues, and all of that depends on researchers, experts who are able to point within their own studies to highlight what's at stake here in a way that attorneys can't do on their own, and our clients are experiencing issues, but the research contextualizes it to make sure that it's not just a one-off encounter, but this really is a trend that we need to address.
Hello? Okay, sorry. Yeah, I'd agree with everything Leah said, and the couple things I'd add, at Brookings, when we're thinking about promoting the public good, we're thinking a lot about democracy, we're thinking a lot about promoting justice and prosperity. And in this, we're in a moment or an era that's characterized by a lot of misinformation and disinformation. And so when we think about sort of promoting knowledge towards the public good, I think a lot about telling the truth, both to help people understand and contextualize, like Leah was saying, what's happening, right? So we've been holding, for example, webinars to help them understand, like, what does federal law actually say about this? Not how the administration is trying to sort of weaponize and reframe federal law without the authority to do so. To empower local actors to sort of know that, the truth and their context is real and it's on their side. And then I also think about, telling the truth of what's happening, the consequences of many of these sort of federal and state policies, and, bringing evidence and research to bear and creating a vision for the future that is more just, like continuing that work that is more sort of future looking and forward looking, not just sort of being reactive, but really leveraging knowledge and expertise and research towards creating a broader vision and helping people sort of understand, like bringing the public along, to Leah's point, in seeing a world that is more just and more prosperous for all, having that eye towards creating more sustainable institutions and so on.
So I'm a professor now, and a big part of my job is training aspiring principals, aspiring superintendents, people to kind of tackle both immediate challenges and also long-term challenges. And I started my career as a teacher and as an administrator, and early on, you confront these problems, these challenges that you're not necessarily fully equipped to handle. As a first-year teacher, it could be a student that is struggling with behavior. As a school administrator in a district that has historically segregated or pushed out students with disabilities, it wasn't immediately clear to me what I was supposed to do to help create a more positive environment for my students. And so I pursued higher education, my master's degree, my PhD, searching for the answers to those everyday problems that I confronted. And sometimes I found them there, and sometimes I found that they were missing. And I became a professor because I believed that through studying these challenges and these issues, I knew that there were great educators out there. I knew there were great principals with more experience and time and ingenuity, and that if we could document them and tease them out, I could, be a better principal, and as a professor, I could help better prepare people to create more inclusive schools where more students thrive. So I see that as being a critical, important role for what we do in higher education, for the role of evidence is that people working in public education have immediate pressing problems, and that we need to better understand the way children learn, the way teachers teach, the way leaders lead. So I think evidence is really critical there, but I also think, unfortunately, that there are challenging, harmful, self-interested, corrupt, power-hungry schemes that are not interested in evidence, not interested in strengthening teachers and principals and public education, but interested in their own benefits. And so while I see the role of education, especially as an education researcher, improving schools, helping teachers, helping principals, understanding more about how children learn and grow, I also see a critical, important role for evidence to push back against these harmful, self-interested, corrupt, power-hungry individuals. And so I think studying intensely is a critical role for all of us. And if we work in public institutions, I believe deeply, because not everyone gets to go to these institutions or gets to work in them, that we do need to serve this public good, which is about building communities with critical thinkers and people who are more civically engaged, reducing inequality. And unfortunately, as we have this kind of toxic, corrupt push, I think we're losing some of that. And so I think now more than ever, the role of higher education, of intensely studying issues, supporting people that are facing real-world problems, but also pushing back on those terrible narratives is critical for us.
We should give him a chance to just drop the mic.
I would like to start by saying thank you to Vivian and Deborah for being in a space to honor Felice and the scholarship that she drives. I am a scholar of the world, but firstly, I am a scholar from Africa. My roots are in Africa, and I am a South African, and South Africa has the horrible honor of being the most unequal country in the world. Inequality means that, if I think from a resilience lens, inequality means that what is predicted as outcomes, public good, the opposite of public good in a country such as South Africa is low academic or education outcomes, low well-being outcomes, low health outcomes, low economic outcomes. For me, education and evidence in education would reverse that predicted trajectory. Instead of the conditions of inequality predicting negative outcomes, we all can do something with evidence to show how we can enable unexpected, unpredicted, extraordinary positive outcomes for education and learning, for people's well-being, for their health, and for economic aspiration. In that, I think there is power. In that, I think we forget all about geopolitical challenges. In that, I think we come together collectively and harness what we know and let that mobilize action for change so that unpredicted outcomes are possible.
I need to start by saying that in the many lives I've led, all the ones you, I think, appropriately left out, Felice has attached herself to me.
Like she does.
You know how she does, right? Felice has attached herself to me. When I was senior vice president, when I was in the government, let's start there, right? She really attached herself to me because she wanted to make sure I had a clear mind about things, about evidence. And the government's role in creating a strong infrastructure that made knowledge and expertise available. When I was in and out of philanthropy, she attached herself to me to make sure that I found ways to support the association and to help giving knowledge and information greater national visibility. I worked with her when I was concerned about trying to create stronger and clearer pathways of emerging scholars into the academy. This was back in the days when you could actually use words like, people of color, marginalized folks, and you could actually focus the resources. I was proud when I was able to give $10 million to AERA to create, that kind of a postdoc fellowship. So she still attaches herself to me. That's the only reason why I'm sitting here. I get these text messages, you need to be on this panel at such and such a time. I'd like to substitute, I'll put my philanthropy hat on, and I'll substitute the word public interest for the public good. And the reason I'm doing that is because I think sort of the deal struck in this country was that in exchange for having a break, not having to these assets taxed, we have an obligation to do work that is demonstrably in the public interest. My goodness, how hard it is to zero in on what that is, right? I mean, I think that is one of the biggest challenges in my business, getting comfortable with the notion that you're doing something that is demonstrably in the public interest. I'll just say 3 things about knowledge and expertise with respect to that. 1, I feel we should be guided by it. We have a moral obligation. 2, we should get very good at organizing it, accumulating it, and making it more widely available and accessible to those who need it. And 3, when we can, we should support its thoughtful, careful, and strategic use. And so I think all of those things in the philanthropic business we try to do. You can use that.
Well, that was a great start. There are many, many threads we could already follow. But why don't we pick up this notion of Kent's proposal that we think about the public interest or but let's think about that. And Leah, when we met, one of the things that I think we all felt very enlightened by and maybe even encouraged was what you told us on that day we talked about what you called that day small wins. But I think you have more to say about as you fit this obligation to be working in however you want to call it, public interest or public good. You are doing work like that in the space you work. Can you share a little bit about what you've been doing? I think everyone would want to hear more about that. And then I think we have some other threads we can pick up as well.
Sure. Well, first of all, today I have a big win, so I'm very excited. The ACLU sued the Department of Education challenging the Dear Colleague letter and its enforcement. On February 14th, the Department of Ed issued a Dear Colleague letter with sweeping generalizations that are unsupported by facts or law, saying that Title VI prohibited, that DEI violated Title VI, and also a sweeping misinterpretation of the Supreme Court's ruling in Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard. They followed up after that, directing schools and school districts at the local and state level to fall in line and comply with their directives within 14 days, and also began investigations in 45 universities for failure to comply. A few weeks later, they issued a certification requirement, giving school, state, and local education agencies just 10 days to say, we agree with your interpretation of Title VI and SFFA, and we are going to follow. And the threat behind that was explicit. If you don't follow, we are going to, 1, revoke all of your federal funding, 2, weaponize the DOJ against you to claw back already provided federal grants and contracts, 3, initiate False Claims Act investigations, which involved treble damages, and also there were individual consequences. So 3 civil rights organizations sued. Today, 3 civil rights organizations won, and the Dear Colleague letter is no longer in effect. So we are very, very excited about this. The scope of the 3 orders are a little different. Our order is specific to NEA, the National Education Association. They have 3 million members. The Department of Ed cannot enforce the DCL at any place where they are employed. And we also have the Center for Black Educator Development Planners. Another order is a little bit broader. So the cumulative effect of all 3 is that the DCL is not in effect. That means also that we are all going to be on appeal and all defending these wins. But I consider that to be a huge win which has very tangible consequences and tangible impact for teachers. We've seen people immediately, by people I mean states, school districts, principals, clawing back programs because none of these items define what DEI is. It was an intentional effort to chill whatever could be defined as DEI, which is what our judge included in today's order. So that is a huge win. And we are continuing in this fight. I would say other big wins that we have had, which now I hate that I call them small wins, were in Florida, we obtained an order blocking enforcement of the Stop Woke Act, the higher education provisions. We are waiting any day now for the court to rule. It's been almost 11 months of waiting, and we know we made very strong arguments. I can't predict what the court will do, but completely blocking enforcement of that law, which limits instruction on racism and sexism that the government doesn't like. And the state of Florida has taken such an extreme position that they can control every single word that's spoken by instructors in public university classrooms, down to issuing transcripts or passing laws that they can't criticize the government. In New Hampshire, we also obtained an order blocking enforcement of HB 2, which was a similar educational gag order in the K-12 context. Just 2 weeks ago, the First Circuit heard oral argument, so we're waiting on a decision there. And also in Oklahoma, we obtained an order blocking enforcement of the higher ed provisions of HB 1775, the same thing, recognizing that the state can't control what professors are teaching. And then also blocking 2 of the 8 or 9 so-called divisive concepts from that we've seen copied and pasted throughout. So we certainly consider those to be wins, but short of wins, there are other ways that we can win. I think about my colleagues at ACLU National who sued 3 times and won 3 times, overturning the Muslim ban before one version stuck, which means that there were modifications. Like we can win by losing if that means that the government has to pull back some of the unconstitutional or unlawful directives that they have. And then also just thinking about in Oklahoma, where only 2 of the concepts were overturned as being found to be unconstitutionally vague, we work with the teachers' unions there to publicize all of the different ways, the different information. We argue to the judge, look, teachers don't know if they can teach this, they don't know if they can teach that, what about this? And when the judge said they can continue teaching them, then it was on us to work to get that out, to just restore faith in teachers that they can teach what is true and accurate and what their students need to learn, especially when it's required by the academic standards. So we are still moving forward and also recognizing that as we move up the ranks, the court composition is what it is, but I think today's wins show that across the board, judges are recognizing the unlawful nature of these directives, and we're hopeful that we can either completely overturn them or significantly limit the impact.
So at the beginning, when you started off in your at the very beginning of the session, you said talking about teaching what is true and about truth. And I wonder if all of you might sort of connect that to the question of evidence, because evidence, people mean lots of things by evidence. So when you think about however you think about in the work you do, about advancing truth and using evidence, given what David said emphatically, when people may not value it, may not trust it, may not understand it, and in a community where a wide range of research is done with very different methods and produces a wide range of evidence. How are you all thinking about how we communicate about it, what we're calling evidence, how we build trust in it, how we build value in it? We're seeing a real retrenchment in that, if there ever was a high point in it. And I think you probably all have things to say about that that would help move our conversation forward. You'd like to go, Lisa?
Yeah, thanks. I'd like to share an anecdote on how evidence can be misused also. So 30 years ago, South Africa became a democracy. And using evidence, our Department of Education decided to amplify all teaching and learning in English, although we have 11 official languages. 30 years down the line, of our 10-year-old children, only 20% of the children can read with comprehension. So in large-scale education assessments, we consistently go down the scale. So we had a wonderful change in a policy directive at the beginning of this year with a new department, our Minister of Education, who went to scholars and said, what should we have done differently 30 years ago? And this person shared all the knowledge, all the evidence that has been there for such a long time that home language, learning to read in your home language matters for the trajectory of your education. And if I say that, I get goosebumps all over. So now, for the first time in our country, a child who goes to school will sit in a classroom en nou gaan ek in Afrikaans praat want julle gaan nie 'n woord verstaan wat ek sê nie en ek gaan na julle kyk en julle gaan wonder wat ek dink. So what I did now was speak in my home language. So imagine if you are a 6-year-old and you get into a classroom and the person in front of you trust and you're excited to be with speaks in a different language and you're trying to work out what on earth they're saying. You won't even come close to being able to encode and decode words. So this is the exciting thing when government does decide to then go to evidence and say, how can we do this differently? And a country mobilizes that knowledge. And we're all excited to see what will happen down the line in the next 30 years when evidence is used to support education for the public interest and the public good.
Something your question made me think about was this idea of public interest. First and foremost, my experience in Texas being very public, I've met people from very different perspectives, and I do think among Texans and among Americans and among people of the world, there is an interest in evidence and in truth. It's not always the interest of people in power for that truth and to be widely disseminated, but I feel very hopeful that there's a deep interest in it. And I think in higher education, we have an ethical imperative to break down some of the silos that we have created ourselves. We often, we have different divisions, we have different departments in colleges of education across universities, and sometimes we're talking past each other. We're often in these silos, and I think for all of us, a dose of intellectual humility is critical right now so that as researchers from varying perspectives, taking on, using different methods, different epistemologies, that we need to be working in solidarity with each other right now. I think the public needs us to be doing that right now. And so I think in higher ed, from the higher ed perspective, as much as possible, trying to appreciate the perspectives of other scholars who look at have different questions or come at those questions differently, I think is really important because we do need to come together to help bring a fuller truth to the general public. I think that's in their interest.
Yeah, I think, the only few things I would add, I think we really need to embrace the project of sort of rebuilding trust and expertise and appreciate that there is a lack of trust and expertise. There's a lack of trust in institutions, and we have to come at this project acknowledging that. It's it's difficult, and the context we're in right now, as David was pointing out, is much been manufactured by bad faith right-wing actors who want to undermine the public's faith in education, in higher education and public education. And so, I think we need to realize that. I think we just need to acknowledge that. And I think we all need to practice more engaging in public scholarship. Coming out of the academy and going into Brookings, I had to reframe what I thought of as my expertise. Because in the academy, I thought of experts as I published for 10 years on this in lots of journals, and I've had awards, and people think of me as the person who does X. But then I moved to DC, and you realize that that is not what expertise means when you are in policy conversations with people who are generalists working across many different areas. And so, the current iteration of the Department of Education is being run by people who are aggressively unqualified and who have no expertise in basically anything they're doing. And so we all as a collective, education researchers need to embrace our expertise narrow and broad and be speaking out and talking honestly about what's happening, the consequences of what's happening, the context around what's happening to help people understand and rebuild that trust and expertise.
Nothing said on that.
I think when we think about evidence, when you think about evidence, as you've all said, there are a variety of kinds of things. And David, you're calling for more respect for and appreciation of a variety of methods and kinds of evidence. But we all know that whatever the evidence is that you present in any context, they don't speak for themselves, which suggests that there's perhaps a new or greater demand on us to have communication skills for communicating with people who don't see the world with any of the ways that we do. I'm thinking about this idea of the public interest and wanted to ask you, Kent, who gets to decide what that is and how do we communicate about that? And I'm wondering how in the different work you're doing, I can hear it already in things you've said, that communication, use of language, use of thinking about whom you're talking to and for what reason is really critical. And I wonder if you could sort of make that more visible to all of us about how you're thinking about the demands for communication at these times and how you use evidence in that communication.
I can start the ball rolling. So I think with communication, the research without partnerships don't make sense. So from the onset, from that first question of wanting to study something, a partnership is required. And that partnership needs to be ecosystemic. So it needs to go through the various spaces and sectors where you would like whatever you find out to potentially have meaning and can be used. And so if that buy-in in a particular question is there from the onset, and people feel that they can also have a voice in co-constructing how that question will be approached and asked, that matters. It drives the whole impetus. And it gives momentum to the research. So I think partnerships, having strong partnerships with other academics across countries, across institutions, urban and rural spaces, people who work at nonprofits, people who work at faith-based organizations, people who work at funding organizations, all those voices and perspectives matter from the beginning. And then, as you said, it's not enough to publish a peer-reviewed article. It's not enough to publish a book. That should happen anyway. That's what we paid for. That's what we do. What we need to do besides that is package that evidence in a way I'm struggling with the English word, is digestible, can be accessed, is formulated in such a way that somebody can say, ooh, I understand that and I can do that. So maybe digestible sound bites. Whether we use WhatsApp forums quite a lot, if we have a large project and we have findings, to have like 5 core points, and on a WhatsApp we circulate that to teachers who are part of that, or to teacher unions, or within government spaces. We will have consultative forums in communities to share with a chief of a community or leaders in the community, to have discussions around it where they can ask questions in their own home language and we can explain what we found and how potentially that could be used. So I think it's going the extra mile, not just that publication, not getting your dissertation or your thesis, but thinking, what now? So what? We did this. How can it be used? How can it be? What is the utility of this finding, this evidence?
Well, just to piggyback on that and to connect to this issue of trust, which we had a chance to talk a little bit about this morning, and I think it's very pertinent to return to now. And I do think the research community in various ways needs to take more interest in what the public is interested in. I'll say it like that. Because I think that would get us on the path to rebuilding the kind of trust, understanding, and confidence in what we do. It's, I spend a lot of time these days trying to build the capacity of advocacy groups and civil rights organizations to consider the evidence, to build their own capacity and sophistication in grappling with the evidence and asking their own questions about whether the evidence has any basis in their reality. I'll put my Wallace Foundation board hat on for just a second. That's a place that has very particular, or has had very particular views about the kind of evidence that matters, that's useful, and the like. And then in the last couple of years, we decided that we should actually rethink our work in the arts. And suddenly, RCTs, an R squared of over 3, none of these things made any sense to people in the arts communities, right? And so we've had to kind of go back to the drawing board and ask ourselves, does the kind of work with which we're confident and familiar add real value? Why would people in the arts world trust anything we have to say? What we're going to do to build trust, we've just launched it yesterday, is a landscaping effort where we will work with arts communities, particularly communities of color, to try to really zero in on the questions they're trying to answer, the kind of information and evidence and expertise that would contribute, to the work that they do, and then see if we can advance a research agenda that amplifies that. One test of whether or not we've made a difference will be whether or not they find the work we support demonstrably useful, and in their interest. So I think there's a lot of work to do there. I was taken with the comments toward the end of the open session last night about higher education's role. That's a larger trust problem that we really need to work on. So I think that's a theme that's going to require some continuing attention here at the association.
Sorry, there's only 2 things I would add, following up on some of the comments we've heard so far. One is that as researchers, I also think it's really important we build relationships with journalists. Media are often in a position where they're translating research, and journalists are just people, and building relationships with journalists can go a long way in helping to frame their understanding of these problems that they're reporting on, and getting your research and other research that that's like high quality and good work out there, right? So thinking about that as another dimension of relationship building, I think, is really important. And then I think there's also like this sort of translation issue, one that I've really had to learn to navigate moving from a more academic institution to Brookings. And that's trying to hear the heart of the question that people are asking, not necessarily the specific question they're asking. So for example, over the last few months, we've gotten a lot of questions around what would it mean if Title I were to be eliminated? And there's a way to answer that question that's pedantic and in the weeds based on the research, but what is the journalist really asking? They're asking what would happen if these billions of dollars were to go away overnight? And we know money matters in education. That's a consistent finding over decades of research. And that's the thing you want to get across in that conversation. And so I think there's this sort of translation piece that we need to, again, I've certainly been practicing, that I would encourage all of us to be paying more attention to as we engage in public scholarship.
Can I just add to that real quick? So something I've learned, education journalists tend to, especially in your state and local regional outlets, to be the least experienced journalists out of the core. And so often expertise means explaining and helping them even frame the issue in the first place. And they confront a big challenge that I do think folks exploit, is that they are trained to tell two sides of the story, to kind of get these different perspectives. And in a perfect society, we would want to hear kind of both sides of the story. But in the imperfect society that we live in now, I think some groups are exploiting that idea. And so you're pitting a toxic, harmful, racist, sexist, xenophobic narrative that has no place in our country, and then asking for the other side. After Uvalde happened in Texas, a journalist said, well, Governor Abbott said, Chicago has the strictest gun safety laws in the country, and yet look at the murders there. Gun laws would not have saved any lives in Uvalde. And the journalist literally asked me to respond to that point. And I thought, wow, like, it's a well-intended journalist, but like, wow, you know, the governor is able to set the agenda, and then they get someone on one side and someone on the other. And so as much as possible, even helping journalists understand what the actual issue is. I mean, the day after, you know, 20 kids and teachers are killed in an elementary school, that's the story. Is here's what Governor Abbott said. Here's the people who are saying that gun laws wouldn't have saved those kids, and here's the person saying against. So I think we can all help journalists better translate those stories, point out those particular issues. I think that can be really helpful. And just related to that, data is really important. Nice bar graphs and charts are important, but narratives really, really matter. People's actual stories help policymakers, help journalists tell different stories. And so however we collect data, however we analyze data, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, there are still stories in that data, and we have to pull that out and help translate not just the empirical findings that get reported statistically, but also those stories. We have to share those, and I think that can really help.
Yeah, I'll weigh in briefly. I agree with everything that has been said, and I'm always reminded that we are dealing with a very vocal minority that is very loud, but they don't represent what people want for their students or for their own educational career. And obviously you all are in a position to make that clear in various ways. The different ways that what is at stake here is not so much that like people overwhelmingly want censorship or they overwhelmingly want to get rid of DEI or whatever the next weaponized term will be, but the gap in understanding I think is very important there. And I also agree with providing information to reporters sometimes just on background so they know when they look at the order, they're seeing what I see. Or they're searching for the same outcomes, I think is also important. And then I also think continuing to hold the line on disparities, particularly racial disparities, because we are losing a wealth of research at the federal level. And for me, as a racial justice attorney, we do bring sometimes equal protection claims. And we have alleged in Florida that the Stop Woke Act targets Black educators and students. And in Oklahoma, that the law, HB 1775, is racially discriminatory against people of color. And on both sides of that claim, we have to prove both that the law has a racially discriminatory purpose and a racially discriminatory impact. And just in the current situation, it's becoming harder to prove that. We don't have the numbers at the federal level to support the racial disparities that we know exist. And so continuing to hold the line there, and then also to just be engaged as researchers. If you are speaking up and you are attending, I don't know, a hearing to provide testimony about why a bill is wrong or why it will disproportionately impact BIPOC kids, then making sure that testimony, like you document that testimony so that advocates can also have that as something that was before the legislators. They knew before they passed this law that it was going to impact this group, and they did it anyway.
One of the controversies in many campuses right now is a claim that we need to be neutral. And I'm wondering, given what David said, it sounds as though there's not a sense on this panel that neutrality is what's called for or that was ever possible. But we've talked about advocacy, we've talked about evidence, we've talked about communication. And I'm curious whether you think that given that we are not just a research association, but the Education Research Association, do we have any special resources and skills to bring to this challenge of communication because we are educators in the main? Is there something special we can meet this moment in the way that we fight this battle that merges the need for non-neutrality and evidence and advocacy and research? How do we meld those with our identities and our backgrounds as educators in the work that any of you does? I think you do that, so I'm curious how that plays out. I feel like I'm supposed to be raising hands.
When I hear neutral, I'm always unsettled. And I actually love being subjective, monitoring my subjectivity and being aware of it, but revering the fact that I come into the space with beliefs, values, practices that I've been socialized into and continue to be framed around. I would say as educators, humanity, the essence of humanity, of kindness, of generosity, of an abundance of collective knowledge would be a signature strength of educators. Human development is possible because of trust, of empathy, of relational longevity. And I think that kindness and generosity in the midst of all the hardship and all the disruption is what brings people together and enables collective action and agency. So I think that trust leads to collective efficacy and agency that ultimately could lead to public interest and public good.
I guess I do think we have an obligation to help our colleagues grapple with difference and struggle with the different ways of knowing and the implications of those different ways for how we interpret what we're looking at and the sense we decide to make of one set of findings or another. I think we could be better at that. I think we could do a better job of deciding what to argue about in public. It's okay to have them, but they should be arguments about really important things. But on the question of neutrality, I'm not so sure that should be our aspiration. I know. Because at some point, to be entirely neutral, I think just gives up a lot of ground. And it sort of puts you in a position where you can't make the progress that's needed in this country. I mean, if we decided to be entirely neutral right after Brown v. Board of Education, we wouldn't have had a civil rights movement, for crying out loud. So I struggle with the neutrality thing. I have to, because I'm working at a place right now that is desperately trying to be neutral. I can't tell you how hard the challenges that raises, when you want to hear a little more about that? All right. So let me tell you a little more. You made the important point just a little minute ago that there's a very small, if vocal, minority kicking up a lot of dust. Right after the election, folks in the new regime described that as a mandate. As a mandate. And I said, well, this might be a moment to turn to the prevailing opinion data about where the public actually is. And so I did, a colleague of mine did, and we said, this is interesting. The public actually doesn't think this is a mandate, right? So we proceeded to describe where the public actually is on a set of issues, right? And then I said, well, anything Kent says is really something Hewlett is saying. One thing I'm looking forward to once I'm destitute and unemployed is that Kent can say what Kent wants to say, right? But anyway, since I knew I wasn't just talking for Kent, I said, let me take this paper, this op-ed, and hand it to the communications people in the foundation to be sure they're comfortable with me telling this story, right? And bless his heart, the director of communications, asked me, this is very interesting, Ken. What are you doing with this? And I said simply, I'm doing my job, for crying out loud, right? You don't spend $20 million or more trying to advance an agenda around a public education as a public good, and then when somebody jumps up and says, we got a mandate to privatize it, I can't be neutral. So that's my explanation.
I was just going to say, so first of all, at a time where we're reflective on what we can do, I do want to acknowledge that we do a lot. ARA does a lot. Our other associations do a lot, and I think that's really important. And I also want to say, I don't know that I want every president to take a stance on things, because I don't know what that stance might be, but I do think all of our institutions, particularly institutions of higher ed, they should have a strong bias towards democracy, towards inclusion, and towards lifting up diverse voices. I think those are the things that I would like to see happen in any organization, is having rich, robust dialogue, ensuring that a diversity of voices are at the table, diverse sources of information are at the table. And I think whether it's our association or our institutions, having biases towards those things, I think could be really helpful versus relying on individuals or associations to, pretend like they are or are not neutral. I think just really being clear about what your core values are and using that to signal to the community what needs to happen.
Yeah, I think along those lines, when you look at the so-called divisive concepts, the prohibited concepts that we see at the federal level in Executive Order 13950 and all of these state bans, educational gag orders, many of them include a prohibition on teaching that concepts of meritocracy, objectivity, or neutrality are racist or sexist. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying that neutrality or objectivity are bad, but I do think we have to be very clear about when those terms can be used to perpetuate systems of oppression or the status quo in ways that become so salient and invisible that students just take them for granted, that this is the natural order of things. And so in our cases where we've argued that those provisions are vague, especially on behalf of higher ed professors, they're asking questions. For example, Shelley Park, one of our professors at the University of Central Florida, is a feminist theories professor. So in her field, it's foundational that racism and sexism exist. And when she is teaching in Florida, she has to ask, what does it mean to teach objectively? Can I show my students that there is a foundational understanding within this discipline? If I introduce a concept that the government doesn't like, do I have to introduce another concept to rebut it? Do they have to have 1-to-1 ratio? What if that concept is widely widely discredited and has been rebuked from the discipline. If I test on one theory and not another, does that mean I'm not objective? Like, there's a lot that goes into what it means to be objective, and most importantly, who is the arbiter of what is objective? And so I think there are dangers in that being the standard, and we have really argued for research supported by accepted methodologies by that discipline. I can't tell you what that is for everyone, but I obviously trust academics to make those judgments, and those should happen within the academic community, not from the political community.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, just I think to try to tie some of these threads together, is I think it's really important in this moment that we keep in mind like what the broader motivations of these right-wing actors are. They're not trying to improve any of these institutions. They want to privatize K-12 education. They are trying to dismantle higher education, right? Like, I think there is, and you see this sometimes with journalists, like there is a veneer of rationality in some of the things or some of the reasons that they use to justify their actions, right? Like, we need to, get serious about redundancies in the Department of Education. I don't know anybody who would argue that there might not be any redundancies in the Department of Education, but these people are not serious about anything that they say that they are trying to do, right? They're not trying to make any of these departments more efficient. They are trying to destroy the Department of Education. And so we need to keep their like actual broad motivations, which they say out loud all the time, like we're not intuiting anything, in mind. And I think neutrality in this moment means complicity in the demise of these institutions that we have all built our careers on, right? We are educators, we care about public education, and we need to keep that in mind. And I think the last thing I really want to say or just emphasize is that like they know they don't have the public on this, and that's why they're trying to implement this through anti-democratic means. And we have to keep that in mind and rally the public towards a more just and equitable future, because by and large, we agree about a lot of stuff related to the importance of public education, to the importance of higher education.
Take up one more issue and then open it up to our colleagues in the room. One of the things we've been talking about across the meeting is the attack on language, if you will, and the way that the language slips. So over many decades, the language that we've used to talk about justice has been in other terms, and right now what we're seeing is a big inflammation of borrowing certain terms. On my campus, for example, we're not allowed now to use the words diversity, equity, and inclusion in the same sentence, even though those are three of the values of the university. But there are other examples of this all over the place, and I think one of the controversies that people are grappling with in different settings is when the work depends on the language in order to advance the attacks on, to attack white supremacy means naming it, or does it mean that you can't do the work once you've done that? And I don't mean to lean toward one answer or another, but people are grappling with this right now. When is using the language crucial? When are we complicit when we call things different things? Our DEI offices are now called equity and access and excellence. And I think that's happening everywhere. And I'm curious what your thoughts are about the role of language, the importance of sticking to it, or being willing to do the work in somewhat more fugitive ways, calling it some other things, but doing the work. What are your thoughts about that?
If I may, I'd like to use the lens of resilience for a kind of a theoretical framing there. So resilience would argue, especially from sustainability science, that any disruption can have a systems reaction that can either be absorptive, adaptive, or transformative. So I guess if you think that you, as an academic, would like to just absorb the shock of what is going on, then you would not use language in a way that would be harmful to you and would have the negative consequences that you explained. If you wanted to be adaptive, you could potentially mold it a bit that you could get away with doing the research that you wanted to, but not being at the forefront of being targeted for negative consequences. However, if you wanted that disruption to lead to transformation, then it would call you to do something that would put that whole system that's now in dissonance, in even more dissonance, so that transformation is possible. I must, however, say that depending on where one is in your scholarship, in your life stages, your career stages, in the spaces where you work, it would be okay to absorb, adapt, or transform. I think if you're part of larger groups in spaces where your own income is secure, then you could vantage into transformed action. However, if you are in a space where you could lose your job and your family could be without an income, and that could put your kinship at risk, then maybe to absorb a bit of that change with language would also be sufficient. I don't think there's a good or a bad in that, and certainly sustainability science shows that either of those responses lead to positive outcomes.
Yeah, I think a few things about this. One, the uncertainty of what you can and cannot say is intentional, because when you see conservatives talking about what they want to prohibit, that's not exactly what they're putting. Even in the EOs and the Dear Colleague letter, it does not say you cannot say diversity, equity, and inclusion, but they want to make it broad enough that you don't know what it could be considered to be supportive, so you steer clear of it altogether. And I think that that is important to keep in mind and document where you're unclear about what you can say. But also, I'm a little reticent to say give them this term, because I don't believe, and I think history does not support, that this is what they're actually after. We saw a quick pivot from critical race theory to DEI, and we see Chris Rufo, one of the main manufacturers of this frenzy, the hysteria, saying he doesn't really care about DEI. He really doesn't want any consideration of race. So we've seen pivots throughout time, and I'm not saying that those are always bad. Now a lot of people are talking about access and opportunity instead of affirmative action, and I agree with that. That's polling well and resonating with people, but I think recognizing that you can't give enough to this administration for them to get off of your back. Even looking at Columbia, they have folded. I will say folded in my personal capacity. They folded and they still lost funding. There is not a way that you can over comply. You can't anticipatorily comply enough for this administration not to decide that they will target you. And I think continuing to give away language that is associated with race makes it seem like race is off limits in a way that, or is any consideration of race is illegal in a way that no court in this country has ever said. You hear it from the president, but that's not actually the law. That's what he wants to be the law. And so I think there's certainly a balance between everybody has a boss, everyone has funding at stake and other things, that's important. But continuing to hold the line where you can hold it, I certainly think is important. And where you cannot hold it, which is a reality for many people, documenting what the changes you have made are. So if we ever get on the other side of this, there's a roadmap to what has been lost.
Be a great moment to open it up to all of you. We have about 15 minutes or so, and we do have mics, so if you'd be willing to, we'll come out and bring a mic out to you, and if you'd be willing to say who you are, that would be great, and ask a question of any member of the group up here.
Thank you. Tess. Charles Young, University of Illinois, retired from University of Illinois. So my question is, it could be a little laugh out loud question, but since there's an attack on the public school and higher education, my question is, do you think we as educational researchers would make a good politician in order to be directly in decision-making spaces versus indirectly being in that space? What is the disconnect? What do you think would be the disconnect? Would it be an advantage? Because people can interpret things however they want to. Politicians get the space to with the media, and they end up making the final decision at the end of the day. But just the fact of being in that space where educational researcher may be able to bring that advanced expertise firsthand into that space, as opposed to looking at some kind of literature or looking at some research, because once again, if there's no interest in the people, because politicians out to somewhat deceive the people to get their interests about. So I guess my question
fundamentally is, will education and research make good politicians to be in that space directly for change?
I know some researchers who turn themselves into politicians. I do think another version of that question would be, if we want expertise and evidence to play a bigger role in policy decisions, what might the research community do to work toward that aspiration? I'm not sure I have an answer to it, as much as I think it's an important question for this association and others. I mean, Bill Firestone wrote an article years ago called The Ecology of Games, in which he actually laid out how ideas and information travel up and down the sort of ecosystem, and the many different places from which politicians or administrators or practitioners get their information and on what they rely. So in some ways, this too goes back to questions of trust. If there was more of it, there might be more inclination to hear from us. If there were more about which we could agree, that too, I think, would make a big difference. Wouldn't get us all the way there, but some things have to be true. And if we could just agree about a few of them, I think that would go a long way. I mean, we're better at taking the world apart in the academy than we are at putting it back together again. I'll just leave it at that.
I don't think an educator should be a politician, nor do I think a politician should be an educator. I think what is required is in order to have the trust for times of disruption and times of vulnerability, we need long-term partnerships. We have a brave director in rural education in our country, Dr. Phumzile Langa, who was one of the first Black women in our country to say she wants to develop policy for education in rural schools, and she wanted to do it in an evidence-based way. And she co-opted education researchers from across the country and in Africa to be part of a working group for such a policy framework. I think that taking hands, having that space of kindness and generosity to share what is available collectively really helps for politics and for education, because listening to what a politician has to say is also beneficial for us as educators to think of what our blind spots are and how we are dealing with societal issues.
I want to just comment. It's a great question, and let's not just be thinking about Trump and the federal government. We need professors to run for school board in their communities. We need education researchers to be involved in local politics. A lot of what plays out in how we make sense of these words is not just in these lawsuits, but what happens in school board meetings, in those important hiring decisions within school districts, be active in alumni associations, whatever it is. But I do think there's a need for all of us to be more engaged at the local level, for sure. And I've known some professors, and it's been really interesting to see them, some of them without practitioner experience, get on school boards and become better professors and be excellent school board members that are truly impactful.
I was one of those people, although I need you to know that when I ran, my wife voted against me. That's.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me? I'm Lila. I'm from Simon Fraser University in British Columbia, Canada. And it might be a trick question, but I will do my best to ask it in an honest way. So my work is on EDI, anti-critical race theory, critical theories. And so I know those attacks on higher education and EDI to be through. But I feel that there is also a mission on our hand. So I'm Jewish. I can see anti-Semitism. I know what we talk about and what we don't talk about. I'm sure that some of my colleagues will say the same about anti-Palestinian racism. And I know that those issues are not only made up things by the conservative or as an attack. I know that we also have blind spots. And I can see it in my students. I can see how identity can be a place that is really leading to lack of empathy. I can see how we're moving away from, civil movements and collaborative work. And I think that in a way we need to do this double move of fighting outside, but also have this critical reflexivity of where we are wrong. And I feel like I don't hear it here. Like I keep on hearing that we need to push back. I agree. I'm there fighting, pushing back, but are we going to look inside as well? So this is my question.
Well, I think that for me, one of the messages that I've heard across the panel today was one of collective action. I think collective action is possible through introspection and collective reflection. I think identity is attacked. And I think currently as an outsider visiting your country, obviously it's at a nexus, a point where it's legislated. I come from a country where 40 years of legislation led to people being oppressed. So it is a dangerous space, and it is a time to both introspect and also act collaboratively. I think collaboration rather than competition always makes more sense. We had a brave president, Thabo Mbeki, who said, if we do, the one thing we can do right is to not stop talking. So not to have oppositional spaces, but spaces of engagement and participation. And I think when I use the word partnership, I mean participate. So across systems, to have that introspection together, alone and together.
Yeah, and I agree with everything that has been said. I would add, I don't think you can censor away any anti-Semitism, just like you can't censor away racism or sexism. And when I think about how we ended up, even 5 years ago, we weren't in this exact same moment. We got to this moment after the very brief racial reckoning where people were talking about the ways that schools have never fully served the identities and the needs of marginalized communities. And we were thinking about what could be added to fully serve those needs. And now we're just trying to get back to a status quo that we already know didn't work. So that is a reality, and I agree with you. And I think it is the reason that we should be bringing in the types of pedagogical strategies, the types of courses and instruction that were starting to come in before we got this backlash. But I think the point of it's a sleight of hand that we've had from the conservatives because we were attacking a system for its insufficiencies, and now that rug has been pulled from under us, and we're defending a system that is not perfect, and we have to recognize isn't perfect, but it has somehow become harder to address those underlying issues. I'm not a researcher, so I don't know the best way of solving the issue, but I just wanted to say I do see it, and I think it was intentional on the other side's part.
This is not a question, but I think there is something that needs to happen because we're all trying to show you that we can keep a secret, Felice, and here it is. our champagne toast to Felice.
I agree.
So as we wrap up, Felice, thank you for
One of
giving.
my favorite things to do.
Thank you. I hope that you see how much the leadership you've provided around encouraging us to think about hard issues in difficult times and the role that we can play with research and evidence. Hope you can see from this wonderful panel and the room how important that has been to all of us. So,
I just this could not have been a better planned panel. This is definitely not only a strand of my commitments, but I want you to know that you're going to get a calendar invite so that we can reproduce this session at the convening center. Thank you all for coming.
can you please join me in thanking our panel today?